start. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Courageous Conversations. This month, we are going to be talking about sundown towns. What happens after dark in Southern Oregon? And we would like to introduce all our hosts this morning, afternoon, I keep saying morning, where we have started this courageous conversation, and we talked about it about a week ago when we met, and it's been a little over a year since we started this. So we thank you all for being here with us. I'd like to introduce Reverend Tom Berry from Bethany Presbyterian, and Reverend Ryan Scott from Newman United Methodist Church, Sally Snyder from RCC, the coordinator of diversity programming, Jenny Jackson, who is not here with us today, and myself, Ernestine Flemister, and I'm the priest at St. Luke's Episcopal Church here in Grand Spass. Our mission with having these conversations is to enrich, support, and celebrate our diverse community by serving as a catalyst for inclusion, continuing learning, understanding, and acceptance through active engagement and facilitation of educational opportunities that challenge our biases and deepen our conversations. Our ground rules: we aim to create a safe space to learn, share, and grow. We encourage you to be open-minded, to listen to all points of views, and be curious. We ask you to suspend judgment as best you can. And we ask you, in respect, to seek to understand rather than persuade or convert the participants. And we also want you to question your old assumptions and look for new insight, discover new insights. Brevity: go for honest, in-depth conversations, and please don't go on and on. Sincerity: speak only for yourself and speak from your personal experiences and personal meaning. Today we have a guest presenter with us. His name is Taylor Stewart, and he started the Oregon Remembrance Project in 2018 to help communities unearth stories of injustice and engage in the necessary truth-telling and repair required to facilitate instances of historical harm. Taylor works to connect historical racism to its present-day legacy in order to inspire contemporary social justice action. In what started as simply a way of memorializing a man named Alonzo Tucker, Oregon's only documented African-American victim of lynching, Taylor has grown to see the power of reconciliation to rectify further instances of historical injustice. So please join me in welcoming our guest today, Taylor Stewart. Taylor.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Ernestine. My name is Taylor Stewart, and I'm pleased to be joining you this afternoon. As Ernestine mentioned, I started an organization called the Oregon Remembrance Project. I help communities unearth stories of injustice and engage in the necessary truth-telling and repair required to reconcile instances of historical harm. I connect historical racism to its present-day legacies in order to inspire contemporary racial justice action. What motivates me to do this work is to do for others what was done for me, by facilitating the same education, experiences, and opportunities that allowed me to grow in this work. Because the truth is, for the vast majority of my life, I was not this racial justice person. In fact, growing up, I actively avoided the topic of race. I grew up in a conservative, white, evangelical environment, and I was a product of my environment. I graduated high school a registered Republican with the dream of becoming a tough on crime prosecutor. However, as I got older, I began to realize that this issue of race that I'd been avoiding my whole life was centrally important to the fabric of our society, and that the answer to the question I'd wondered my whole life of what would I have done had I been around during the civil rights era was what was I doing right now? So, after 2.5 years of a gradual ideological shift, I switched from wanting to be a prosecutor to wanting to do civil rights law. And because of that, it just so happened that in college, I noticed a flyer for this thing called the Civil Rights Immersion. So I signed up thinking I was going on a simple sightseeing trip to the South, but instead this trip would completely alter the trajectory of my life. We traveled to Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas. And when we were in Montgomery, Alabama, I was faced with the question that has changed my life forever. How do you reconcile a lynching? In 2018, the Equal Justice Initiative opened up the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, or the Lynching Museum. The Equal Justice Initiative has documented nearly 6,500 lynchings of African Americans between the years of 1865 to 1950. When you enter the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, you are confronted with these 6-foot-high pillars that have the name of the state, the name of the county, and then the names of everyone who was lynched in that county. And what had always felt like abstract history became personalized when you actually read the names of people who were lynched in this country. I had no idea the magnitude of lynching in America. Name after name after name, what got me most was seeing names with the last name Stewart, knowing that simply time and place separated me from the name on that pillar. Visiting the National Memorial for Peace and Justice was a profound encounter with history for me. I left the museum horrified that I had gone 22 years in this country and no one had ever told me about the extent of this era of domestic terrorism. More so, I couldn't believe that I had to go all the way to Montgomery, Alabama, just to learn that an African-American man named Alonzo Tucker was lynched in Coos Bay, Oregon. I left the museum wanting to share this experience with others. Luckily, in conjunction with the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, the Equal Justice Initiative has also started the Community Remembrance Project. The Community Remembrance Project aims to work in the communities where the lynchings of African Americans took place to find healing and reconciliation through a sober reflection on history. There is an interest form online about getting involved with the Community Remembrance Project. Now, I would love to say that when I first saw that, I immediately was like, sign me up. How can I help? But that wouldn't be true. In fact, I was too nervous to fill out the interest form. After all, this was the Equal Justice Initiative, and I was a recent college grad with no relevant experience. I figured, who am I to really think that I could be of any help? So I decided I wasn't going to fill out the interest form. But thankfully, 2 encounters from the rest of my trip inspired me to change my mind. The first was a quote from John Lewis, longtime civil rights icon and congressman from Georgia, who asked, "If not us, then who? If not now, then when?" This inspired me with the fierce urgency of now. The second was the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. Here, they just focused on Mississippi history, so there was no mention of Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, individuals who we kind of deify and are hard to relate to. Instead, the museum told the story of everyday Mississippians who did their part to pave the way for justice. And so, there at the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum is where I learned that you don't have to be an extraordinary person to do extraordinary things. And so, those 2 encounters gave me the courage to reach out to the Equal Justice Initiative, and my life has never been the same since. So for 3 years, I worked with the community of Coos Bay, Oregon to memorialize Alonzo Tucker, Oregon's only documented African-American victim of lynching, who was lynched in Coos Bay, Oregon in 1902 in front of a crowd of 300. February 2020, we held a soil collection ceremony near the spot where 28-year-old Alonzo Tucker was killed and collected 2 jars of soil. one that has been turned into an exhibit at the Coos History Museum, and the other that was sent back to a museum in Montgomery. June 2021, we unveiled a historical marker in the community to memorialize both Alonzo Tucker and the thousands of other African Americans who were lynched in this country. At the unveiling ceremony, we had over 600 people, double that who were at the 1902 lynching, paying witness to this injustice as we meaningfully added a new chapter to Alonzo Tucker's story. Believe me, while this project ended successfully, it was not without its hurdles. There was real hesitation along the way to want to so publicly acknowledge such a difficult part of the community's history. But that hesitation was able to be overcome. What I was able to inspire the community with was the idea that while we can't change the past, we can always change our relationship to the past. There are two dates of significance on the historical marker: 1902, when the lynching occurred, and 2021, when the historical marker was unveiled. And we can't fully understand the story of Alonzo Tucker if we only focus on that 1902 date, because that 2021 date, when the community came together to try and rectify this wrong, is now forever a part of Alonzo Tucker's story. I've learned some of the most important lessons of my life through my time working with Coos Bay. I learned that no matter where you go, you can find enough people who are willing to choose justice if given the opportunity. It's just a matter of getting them to see where there's been injustice. And that we are all more than the worst thing we've ever done, in reconciling historical harm requires tapping into all else that we are. We lose hope when we stop believing individuals and communities can change, so I choose to remain hopeful. This month, the Coos History Museum held a workshop for other museums on diversity programming. And that is a sentence that would not have existed 3 years ago. But there's something about engaging in this reconciliation work, asking impossible questions and searching for an answer that results in this kind of community transformation. The kind of transformation I would like to help bring to Grants Pass. Grants Pass, like many communities across the country, was a sundown town. The racial segregation of the Jim Crow era was not confined to the South. Whites in the North and West oftentimes purposefully excluded African Americans from entire communities. They were known as sundown towns. Sundown towns, over the course of American history, were a North and West phenomenon. If African Americans were even allowed in town during the day, they had better be out by night or else. Intimidation, violence, and city ordinances enforced a key desirability of the North and West, the all-white community. Signs in the South read whites only or blacks only, but signs in the North and West read, "Nigger, don't let the sun come down on you here." Some towns would literally ring a bell in the community every single day that indicated that African Americans had better leave town or else face the consequences. It is estimated that over half of Oregon towns were sundown towns. This punitive practice understandably achieved its goal. In 1890, 17 of Oregon's 36 counties had 0 to 10 African Americans residing in their community. But as sundown laws began to spread, by 1930, that number would grow to 28 of Oregon's 36 counties. African Americans were pushed into condensed urban centers as the legacy of Oregon's Black exclusionary laws evolved into the 20th century. In 1924, there is an editorial in a Southern Oregon newspaper titled, "Let's Keep Grants Pass a White Man's Town," where the author very explicitly said, "Nigger, we don't want you here." And 46 years later, Grants Pass would still be a white man's town. Oral history posits that there was a sign in town reading, "Nigger, don't let the sun come down on you here," into the late 1960s, early 1970s. In 1970, Grants Pass was 99% white. There were only 6 Black people in the entire community, or 0.05% of the city's population. That's not to say there weren't Black people in Oregon. There were, but only 0.02% of Oregon's Black population resided in Grants Pass. Today, Grants Pass is 0.8% African American, which amounts to 0.3% of Oregon's Black population. We have a responsibility to the history that we inherit. Grants Pass, like many Oregon communities, has been intentionally shaped by decades of exclusion. We are burdened by our history of injustice, but more importantly, we are burdened by our history of silence and inaction. However, it doesn't have to be this way. We have the power to recreate our relationship with history and rewrite the ending to history's stories. I believe that we can rewrite the ending to the story of a sundown town and create an ending where a formerly exclusionary community can become one of the communities most intentionally committed to inclusivity because of their history. We can create a culture that better affirms the validity of each of its citizens to have equal ownership in making this community their home. We can create a community that is better at welcoming others in and making sure that once they're in, they feel like they belong. Grants Pass will most likely always be predominantly white, but that doesn't have to mean it has to be a white man's town. Members of the Grants Pass community have already begun this truth and reconciliation work in the form of an educational booklet that we are going to build out to educate the community on what sundown towns look like both nationally and locally, how this history evolves into the present, and the next steps that we can take to building a more inclusive environment. We want to work with community members like yourself to add to this booklet stories from those who remember Grants Pass as a sundown town, stories of how this exclusion evolved over time, but also stories of those who advance racial justice within the community. There's a motel in Grants Pass called the Motel Del Rogue that used to provide African Americans who were performing in Grants Pass a place to stay, as it was just outside of the city limits. And so, as we talk about sundown towns, it's important that we capture stories like the Motel Del Rogue to remind ourselves that we are continuing a legacy of those in the community who have always fought against injustice. In addition to this booklet, we are looking to install a historical marker in the community, one side discussing exclusionary laws in Oregon and Grants Pass, and the other side functioning as Grants Pass's stated commitment to inclusivity. This marker would be both past and future oriented and makes this commitment a literal part of the geography, a physical reminder of the kind of community we want to be. So while it's the culmination of work, it's really the start of a never-ending journey to live out the ideals written on the marker. My hope is that you will be able to bring your kids or your grandkids to see this marker one day to show them both who we were, but also who we became, and that you were a part of the generation of change. So I hope you'll join me and others in your community in asking the question, how do you reconcile a sundown town? Because it's the search for an answer to an impossible question that results in an impossible transformation. The question, how do you reconcile a lynching, transformed my life, and I believe that this question on sundown towns can have a similar impact in your world. I learned from my trip to the South that it's okay to believe in something even when you've never seen it before, and that it's okay to see something even when others don't believe in it. This would be the first marker of its kind about sundown towns in the entire United States. There are people watching from across Oregon and even Washington and Ohio who are wanting to see what this sundown town reconciliation work in Grants Pass will look like. What we do together has the potential to pioneer for other communities across the country what it looks like to ask the question, how do you reconcile a sundown town? This may seem daunting, but if I've learned anything over these last 3 years, it's that it's less about being the right person for the moment as it is about doing the right thing for the moment. When I was younger, I used to think that it was remarkable people that did remarkable things. However, the older I've gotten, the more I've realized that it's remarkable things that make remarkable people. And I believe that you can be a part of something that's remarkable. Don't underestimate your ability to be the change you want to see in this world, because let me tell you, you don't have to be an extraordinary person to do extraordinary things. Thank you.
Thank you, Taylor.
Yes, thank you, everyone. And we'll be breaking out into breakout rooms. And there are three questions that we want to ask ourselves as a community. How is this history still relevant to us today? What would the opposite of a sundown town look like? And how can we work with our neighbors across the political divide to build a more inclusive community? And today we'll be focusing on the second question, the sort of vision for what we would like to be by focusing on what we think the opposite of a sundown town would look like. And I'll pass it back to Ernestine and Sally.
Thank you. Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, I certainly don't say, oh, my white neighbors, John and Kathy. That doesn't happen, right? Jean, would you go ahead and go next, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So in our group, we had a lot of discussion at first about what we thought it would look like. And, you know, we were talking about having a more equitable society, a place that people would want to live, that people who already live here would want to stay. But we pretty quickly started talking about how we would get there. And that was really difficult because, you know, we don't want to be disingenuous about like trying to bring more diversity to a town that is not welcoming, that is not comfortable, that is not safe. And so, you know, it was really difficult to sort of go from like, oh, we want this beautiful like pie in the sky sort of like it's comfortable, it's safe, people can live here and raise their children and have equal economic opportunity. And, you know, as Melissa said, like live anywhere in town and not be identified as like part of that 0.8% necessarily as like their whole identity, but then how do we get there? And it's really hard when we live in a place that, you know, most people in town would probably not come to a workshop like this and, you know, probably would not make it a pleasant experience to bring people of, you know, various backgrounds to town and make them feel welcome and comfortable enough that we would be able to have an expansion of diversity on all fronts. But that was what we were really talking about, was how, you know, it's sort of this intersection of the way that people live their lives and what they are looking for in terms of like jobs and a place to raise a family and the outdoors and all the reasons that we like living in Southern Oregon, and then all the reasons that we don't, and all the reasons that people tend to leave or don't move here. And so, you know, getting to a place where we would be able to say like our community is the opposite of a sundown town is just from where we currently are a really difficult road where so many things have to change to make everyone feel comfortable and welcome. So we had a really interesting discussion about that.
Thank you. Andre, you're next, please.
Yeah. So yeah, we had an interesting conversation, and it was also started off with the struggle of, okay, so what does the opposite of a sundown town look like? You know, even if you live in a progressive community, we were acknowledging, well, is it really like the opposite? And so we came around this idea of hyper-inclusive communities. You know, again, we have a hard time visualizing that. And the only thing I could think of was Star Trek. You know, it's like I mean, honestly, they're the perfect example of like including everybody, right? And celebrating all of those differences. You know, like was already mentioned, we're a good ways away from that. And that was, again, part of our challenge was, well, what can we do to get there, right? So we were talking about, you know, what we could do for education, or, you know, ways to more vocally celebrate our differences versus, you know, shying away from them or anything. But there is the real challenge of not everyone is going to be open to these conversations. So the real challenge of finding a common ground to have a conversation like this is really challenging. So obviously events like this are great, but we have a long way to go.
Certainly. Thanks, Andre. We can keep it moving, so we got a lot of people who want to say things. Sarah.
Hi. In our group, we also started talking more about how to get to that place rather than defining what it would be. And I think maybe two central ideas came up, but one is addressing our unconscious biases rather, and learning more about what other people are experiencing and what what our view of the world is, and kind of where we're coming from and what other people are seeing as well, so that we can really understand the problem. And then I think we kind of got going then on what do you actually do to make things better? Because I think, I think probably all of us or most of us in this group, are not the main problem here. And so what are we going to do to really expand this out into the community? And that, it's easy for people to say, I'm not racist or I'm not part of the problem, but what are you actually going to do about it to be an ally or an advocate? And I think we're at a point now in our society where we can't just be, within ourselves, accepting or having kind of an inclusive nature, but we need to be more bold and aggressive about speaking up when we see things going on that are wrong, and taking active steps to create more inclusive and welcoming places. So I'll keep it short.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, allyship is very important. Scott Lindbergh.
Well, thanks, Sally. So we had 3 people in our breakout room, and I prefaced my statement or my introduction by saying that I had worked at the city for 15 years and had a lot of access to the city's archives, and this question had come up before, and I did a lot of research and reading, and I couldn't find any record of any ordinance in the city that actually designated us legally as a sundown town. Now, surely we did as convention and as part of our culture, but I would be very interested in if anybody else has any research that shows that legally we were a sundown community, that we can address it from that aspect. As far as how to, what an opposite of a sundown town is, we discussed, first of all, what a sundown town is, one that actively keeps people of color away. And the opposite of one would be a community that actively tries to embrace and expand our culture and our demographics. But we weren't absolutely positive how to get there. We talked about potentially looking at other communities that have grappled with this issue and have overcome it, to see if we can learn from their how they did things, and learn from their mistakes and learn from their best practices and go from there. Because surely we would have to, first of all, have to have a change of heart, as has been mentioned earlier. And we did not have a simple solution. And then that was that. But we all acknowledge that in our group that there is an issue here. There historically has been. Our historical relationship with the Klan is not the distant, the KKK is not the distant past. It still comes up from time to time. So there's some sea change that would have to happen too. So I'll cut it off at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we have to envision what our goal, what our dream is, because if you don't have one of those, you can't ever get there, right? So to reach that dream or goal, we have to dream about it. And it is difficult. It's like, how do we do this? But it can be done. Teresa.
Hi, everyone. I was in a group with Gary and Serenity, and we talked about, we shared stories and so on. And we talked about this vision. And it's basically, a town where everyone, no matter what group they might belong to, feels like they belong, that they feel welcomed and not ostracized or othered wherever they go. And typically in public places, we talked about public places like grocery stores and post offices and libraries, apartment buildings, and that sort of thing. And then that kind of got us off onto the influence that people like property managers and hotel managers have in helping someone feel welcome and included in the community. And so that was a thing. And we talked about, again, how to get there. It's we can start with the words. We can start with, acknowledging that there's an issue, and then set our direction And then it's a matter of, taking actions either as an individual or as whatever group we happen to be a part of to start to change attitudes. And that is a long process and it can take many years, but we have to start. And I agree that we need to have that vision in our mind, or we won't know where we're headed. And Gary and Serenity, did you want to add anything to that?
I would just say that about our institutions like schools and courthouses and libraries, whatever, is that there is to create the atmosphere and documents necessary to support that vision. Thank you for that.
I'm going to we have lots more people who want to talk, but I'm going to take a brief moment to follow up. I'm going to put my email address in the chat. So if you're interested in continuing this work, you can email me and we'll organize. Taylor will be back with us in February to talk some more about this. Taylor, did you want to say a piece here?
Yeah, so I'm, so excited to be in this space with you all. So much of this is simply asking the question, and I'm just so encouraged that you guys have been taking this up. And so there are 4 ways that you can help be involved in carrying this work. The first being there's sort of a smaller group of folks, a sort of core coalition. We had our first meeting last month, and we're going to meet again next week. And so if you would like to be a part of that sort of core group that was trying to push this project through the community, Gabby Johnson will put her email in the chat, and you can reach out to her. Another way to be involved is with this sort of oral history project, both as an interviewer or an interviewee. And so to share your knowledge of the community, as well as to be a collector of that history. The third thing you could do is there's a book on sundown towns that I would encourage everyone to read. I'll put the link to it in the chat. But the fourth and sort of easiest, but not necessarily easy way to be involved is simply talk to someone in your life about sundown towns. Ask them those 3 questions. How is this history still relevant to us today? What would the opposite of a sundown town look like? And how can we work with our neighbors across the political divide to build a more inclusive community? And so look forward to coming back to Courageous Conversations in February. But before then, there's a variety of ways you can get involved with this work before then.
Thank you, Taylor. So I put Gabby's email in the chat, and she also told me that it was really common for sundown towns to not document policies or have official city ordinances, and Grants Pass was one of those. So the oral history, newspaper articles, census data becomes what we research to understand our history. So our next meeting is going to be not the fourth Tuesday, it'll be the 3rd Tuesday, November 16th, Rogue River Trail of Tears. And now I'm going to go back to Tom. You have your hand up. Please stay with us as you're able. We understand if you have another meeting. Thanks.
I will be really, really brief because there are so many hands up. We kicked it around, I think, like everyone else from what I'm hearing. I think defining it as a community that celebrates diversity, that lifts up diversity, also as a town or community that doesn't breed fear and doesn't rely on fear. So that piece is too. Of course, I think like everyone else, we didn't come up quickly with a solution, other than there's a lot of work ahead of us. But one of the things that we did talk a little bit as we were finishing up was how this opened our eyes also to not just, this starts surely as a situation of race and a group being targeted, but also asks us the question now, who else are we treating in this way? What other groups of folks, maybe the unsheltered or other folks, are we saying, our actions saying, we really don't want you here at a certain time or a certain place or in a certain way? So there's that bigger lesson to be learned too. So we had a good discussion.
Chris. Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, my group consisted of me and Phil and Cindy Newton. And part of our conversation, we started off talking about In many countries, they have had truth and reconciliation commissions. And in the countries, for example, in South Africa, most of these countries, those are very, very difficult conversations to have for people. Because one of the things that it does is it gives people that did bad things the opportunity to come out and say the bad things they did without fear of prosecution or persecution. But until we can get people in a room to have conversations where we can have a conversation about race, and we do it in a respectful manner, so there's an open dialogue and people feel that they can say what they need to be able to say, but as long as they can say it respectfully. So you have to learn some tact and be able to intercept and put yourself in situations where you may not always be comfortable. Another thing that Phil brought up was what he called the theoretical races. So the theoretical races was where, if you're in a town that's 99% white, for example, you probably have had little to any experience at all with people of color. So you are a racist in theory because you haven't had any practice, because you haven't had anybody to implement some of the leverage of power that comes with that with that racism. And then one other thing that we wanted to talk about is in alternative dispute resolution, one of the tenets in that, they talk about putting yourself in the other person's shoes. So if you can't put yourself in the other person's shoes, it's kind of difficult to understand where they're coming from. And then the final thing is, I heard someone make a comment earlier about social settings here and going to supermarkets and doing some of the things. It's very common here, even when I was in, Arizona, to be the only African American in a classroom or in a building or on an entire campus. So that's common. So it's very common. So depending on who you are as an individual and how comfortable you are with yourself, you kind of learn to adjust those things. So, but those are some things that we came out with our group, and so we're talking about what would a post or a opposite of a sundown town look like. It would look for me, from what I got from our group, it would be a town where we could have honest, open, frank, respectful conversations about race, class, and those type of things. And I think once we in a position where we can have those conversations and people understand where the other person is coming from and why they feel the way that they feel on both ends, I think that will be the beginning towards having a more harmonious community.
Certainly. Thank you, Chris. Samantha, and then Debbie after that.
So my group talked about more of a more, hard to phrase it. They were thinking more, less violence to the kids, and we should be able to be in an area that everybody feels safe, more. Sorry, I'm not very good at speaking in front of people.
Don't worry about it. Thank you.
I brought up a concept that we saw every time we go out of town. We would see a sign that said, "You are allowed, like, visitors welcome, but please don't stay." So more unwelcome signs that come into concept that we really thought would help if we took them down or rephrased them in a way that people would feel more welcome staying here if they wanted to move here, instead of like, we don't really want them here. Even though I understand we are getting a little overcrowded again, we should still be more welcome to people moving here if they feel the urge to get out of where they're at. More April, who was in my group, brought up a area of town that we can put our reconciliation in, that we could involve the caveman who is at the front part of our town, involve him in it and seem more of a I wish April stayed, she would have helped. But more of an open mind to what we could do to make the area seem more welcome.
And thank you for being brave, Samantha. Good job. Good job. Debbie?
Well, so we touched on some of the other things that people have talked about, like implicit bias and different stories that I had growing up. But I think the thing that Melissa mentioned at the very beginning of our discussion is to just be kinder and more welcoming. And I think of, I have a friend in Medford who's Indian, and so she's brown. And I asked her if she wanted to come over for lunch to Grants Pass, and she says, you know, I really don't feel welcome there. I feel stared at. I feel uncomfortable in Grants Pass, which of course made me very sad. But I think if we make a conscious effort to smile, and you know, these days with masks, you can't see a smile, but you can see it in people's eyes. And if we make a conscious effort to stop ourselves at staring at people who are different than us, and to do these little things, that's a way to start counteracting this. You know, these days we don't have the overt lynchings, for instance, but we have these covert kinds of glances that are not welcoming. And I think that's a good first place to start. You know, I liked Taylor's thought of that we don't start out as extraordinary people, but if we start out as ordinary, nice, kind people, we can make a difference in this world.
Absolutely.
That's my favorite thing to do, is smile at people. So yes, and that's a simple thing. We can all do it as we go on. Jasmine had asked, is she still on? Jasmine, did you want to share? I can't see. There's still a lot of.
Yeah, I'm here.
There you are.
Okay.
Yeah. Was it my question that I sent you about
Well,
the time?
I think you said you wanted to share from your group what you talked about. Did you still want to share?
Okay, yes, I can. I do have little children, so if they're loud, I apologize in advance. But so what we talked about was, what do you think an opposite sundown town would look like? And so one of the things, or some of the things that we were talking about was, you know, it'd be like positive, peaceful, everyone can get along. There wouldn't be any discrepancy or, you know, disrespect towards one another, and be more welcoming. We would, some of the things were like, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. I'm nervous. But, you know, like maybe having like, you know, their art, you know, arts from different cultures, you know, like foods, you know, how there was a, you know, like on Mother's Day, there's a powwow in Grants Pass, which I never knew that. So that's pretty cool. But, you know, things like that to interact more and learn more about everyone's different nationalities, cultures, food, even music. And, you know, maybe it would help the communities be more welcoming and understanding with everything and everyone.
Thank you, Jasmine. The other question she had was, our next meeting is going to be noon to 1. So we generally meet Tuesdays, noon to 1, usually the 4th Tuesdays, but next month it will be the 3rd Tuesday. So did everybody have a chance to share who wanted to today? And by the way, hi, Maya. Just noticed you. All right. Thank you so much for coming today, Taylor. It's really, I love having your energy and your extraordinary, ordinary leadership to help us with this project. I'm excited for where Grants Pass is headed. So I hope everybody has a wonderful afternoon. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.